Have you ever promised to make something, then after a few reminders, a short little year passes by, and then you finally get around to doing it? Well, for me, it's finally time that I make some picture frames. In this video, I'm going to share how simple frames are to make, giving you no more excuses to putting this project off. And the first step is to go mill the lumber. You could completely skip this by getting some pre-milled lumber and jumping straight to the ripping, but rough lumber comes at quite a price advantage. Plus, I can get what I want. You don't often find ash at a big box store, and if you did, it wouldn't come this wide or this thick. But you do need a way to surface the faces, and a thickness planer makes quick work of that. But I still need to square the edges, and for that, I'm going to use a hand plane. The plane does two things. It straightens the edge of the board and squares it to the face, but sometimes you get a little off. And it's easily fixed by repositioning your plane on the high side to remove more material from there, bringing the board back to square. But with that, this board is ready for some ripping. With all the stock uniform, you could go straight to turning these sticks into frames, but I'm partial to adding a little style to the ones that I make. I like simple frames, but ones with a bevel on the inside because it allows for more light to hit the subject without adding too much of a shadow line around the edge of the picture. And to keep myself safe and the cut more consistent, I'm using a featherboard for this operation. The next step is to cut the rabbet, which will hold the frame innards, and it could be done a multitude of ways, but seeing as this video is about showing the simplest way, and the project's already well overdue, well, I'm selecting the fastest method, the Dado stack, which I slightly buried in a sacrificial fence to ensure the rabbet is cut all the way to the edge of the material. Now, if I didn't have a Dado stack, I'd do it the exact same way, but with a single blade, making one cut at a time, bumping the fence over a little bit, until I achieve the proper size Dado, which is 3/8 of an inch. And that 3/8 is going to be very important when we calculate the size of all of our frame parts. But first, I like to trim one end at 45 degrees before doing all of the complicated calculations. So here it is, the magic formulae. To determine your rail length, you need to first measure your picture, then add 2 times the rail width plus 2 times the rabbet width. So for this picture, we have 11 plus 2 for the rails plus 3/8 times 2, which equals 13 3/4 for our top and bottom rails. With all the math figured out, it's time to cut the frames to size, which starts with a mark. I slowly start sneaking up on that mark for the first piece, and once I finally hit it, I hold the workpiece in place and add a stop block to ensure all the next pieces are exactly the same length, which is the most important part of picture frames. No matter how perfect your mitering is, if one of your 2 parallel sides are a different length, then your rectangle will end up as a trapezoid and your miter joints will be open, which is not what you want. But just like that, all the rails are done and ready for some pre-sanding of all of the interior faces. And I like to do this ahead of any glue up because otherwise it gets really hard to reach into those inside corners. But speaking of glue up, I'm going to use this ratchet strap picture frame clamp, which applies even pressure in all 4 corners of the frame. And if you're planning on making picture frames, I recommend getting one of these over traditional clamps because it just works so much better. And since you don't have to wait a day for glue to dry, these are ready for some splining. Now, instead of creating some fancy jig, I just made 2 equal distant marks at the end of this miter joint, and then I'm going to line up the teeth on both of those marks. And when they're touching both, I know that I have this spline right where I want it, set up a clamp as my stop, and get to cutting. And the whole purpose of these splines is to add a little bit of strength by putting some long grain across the joint and adding more glue surface, since the miter joints are basically end grain to end grain, so they're a little bit weak. And these could be omitted as they're not really necessary, but they do add to the design of the overall frames. But for now, let's move on to a necessary piece, the glass. Well, acrylic. I like using acrylic for picture frames because 1, it doesn't yellow with age, and 2, it's really easy to cut with my standard woodworking tools. Just make sure to keep on that protective film because it does scratch pretty easily. And here's my tip for cutting the innards. Leave the tools at the same setting. So don't move your fence, don't move your stop block from when you cut the glass, and then cut the backing. That way you make sure that they will be the exact same size. Now it's time to finish the details, starting with trimming the splines and preparing for the spray lacquer finish by doing some final sanding. And as you can see, these frames came together pretty quick. And honestly, it only took a few hours of work spread over a couple of days, but they took the thing that we never have enough of: time. Time tends to pass slowly in the moment and quickly in reflection. Looking back a year ago when I was supposed to make these frames, I'm wondering now why I didn't do it. Time seemed like the constraint, but in all honesty, it was my prioritization. I had other things on my plate, and those seemed more important to me. But the thing is, the most memorable and most important things to me when I look back aren't those things that I felt like I had to do. It was the impacts my time had on those around me. And these frames aren't for me, but for a special person in my life. I made them to hold some artwork my wife had when she was little, but that art has been living its life in a file folder, and she wanted it let out so that we as a family could appreciate it. After all, things aren't precious unless there's love and memories put into them. And that's why these long overdue frames became a priority. And you know what? I'm glad they did, because this project was a lot of fun to make. So I guess what I'm saying is, time can slip by, but don't let that stop you from putting your effort where it really matters.